mics are live. Yeah, mics are live. So, thank you everyone so much for coming. As we begin our gathering for the Women, Life, Freedom panel, we respectfully acknowledge that our event today is taking place on occupied coast Salish land, and that the Seattle University is on the homeland of the Duwamish people. And I'm going to hand the reins off to Doreen.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry I'm reiterating this because I literally had a nightmare that nobody was going to show up. So I really appreciate that. We're going to play a song for you just to start off the conversation. This is a song by a 25-year-old Persian man who was arrested for writing this song. And it is based on the tweets that people started posting following the death of Mahsa Amini. And he just gathered them together. And the reason behind it is that people are writing this and they're saying why they're going to street and losing their lives and fighting. And I really want you guys to think about what freedom means to you, because this is what people of my country is fighting for.
برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک زباله‌گرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه، برای گریه های بیوقفه، برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره ای که میخنده، برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای قرصای اعصاب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی.
Hi, everyone. And once again, thank you so much for being here. I would love to introduce and thank our esteemed panelists today. We have Professor Alejandra Gonza, Executive Director and President of the Global Rights Advocacy. We have Mr. David Woodward, Senior Advisor for Global Engagement with Seattle University. Joining us is also Dr. Azita Emami, Executive Dean of Nursing at the University of Washington. And we have Professor Russell Powell, Professor at Seattle University School of Law and former Foreign Service Officer with the US State Department. On Zoom, we have joining us Dr. John Ghazvinian, Executive Director of the Middle East Center at UPenn. Thank you so much and welcome to Seattle University School of Law.
So I'll go ahead and begin. I'm David Woodward, and I was born in Tehran, Iran in 1957, and my parents were Presbyterian missionaries. My mother, as a single woman in 1946, got on a ship in New York and sailed to Iran to be an educator. And my father insisted on marrying her. And so he followed her to Iran and they married there. And they lived in Mashhad in northeastern Iran the first 5 years. They had to leave Iran during the overthrow of the prime minister in 1953. Just prior to that, went back to Tehran for 5 years, and that's where I was born. And then we came back to the States for a year, went back in 1960 to southern Iran. And as it turns out, it was local people, Assyrians and Armenians in particular, who had started a church in this oil capital of Iran, in Ahvaz, in the plain of Khuzestan, and requested Presbyterian missionary to come. And so that was my parents. So when I think about the theme of women in Iran, it's pretty much women who are responsible for me being born in Iran and growing up in Ahvaz to 1968. So my first 11 years of my life predominantly were in southern Iran. And so the first thought I have when I think about this conversation we're having today, we talk about Iran. Well, I'm thinking my concept of Iran and the memories that I have, which are rich, probably are different from what most people in the US think after 42 years of being deadlocked between US and Iran. Pretty much all we hear in media, TV, film, everything is how Iran is responsible for all the problems of the world and the most dangerous enemy and so forth and so on. My associations are 100% different. And so just for a couple of minutes, I'll just share a couple of my memories from my life growing up in Iran. I call myself an American Iranian. So if you think about it, Americans go to another country, a child is born there, grows up there to age 11. Where were you when you were 11? Where had you been for 11 years? You know that's your home, right? So for me, Iran is my home. And I miss it. Dilam misuze bara Iran. So my heart burns for Iran. So I wish I could go back. I probably can't for a while. I've been thinking about it for 42 years, but it isn't that easy right now if you're an American citizen. And one of the reasons for that, I speak Farsi fluently. I also speak Arabic fluently. If I go to Iran, I could be a danger to local people, not to myself. I would probably be celebrated as the returning son of Iran, you see. But that's not about me. It's about the local people who are really living in an authoritarian state. And it's a very, very dangerous thing for people to be associated with international people, and particularly certain kinds of people. And so, I've had to think about Iran for 42 years in hopes of going back someday. And let me just share a memory or two of those wonderful times in Iran. I got to know women and girls at my age and women around us, family, friends, neighbors. The neighbors across the street, the dad ran the oil company of Iran in southern Iran. So that was, and their kids were my playmates. So I'd go across the street and we'd play cards together and stuff. In the church that my parents started, because of the local Iranians' request, there were people who were Assyrian, Armenian, and people of different European and Asian backgrounds who would come through. There was also a partnership between the Presbyterians and the Anglicans, because often around the world, missionaries would seem to have conflicts and territorial ambitions. And so this was a time in the 60s where people around the world were trying to focus on ecumenical movements and how we could collaborate more together. And I grew up thinking a lot about how my parents were trying to work as bridge builders. And that was very, very important to me. So in any case, I got to visit lots of Iran. They're up in the north. You probably don't know this, but by the Caspian Sea, it's an incredibly lush green area. If you go up to Tabriz in the northeast, it's a beautiful mountainous area. The very first Americans were established out in northwestern Iran, in the Tabriz Urumia area. And that's where the roots, I'm 5th generation Presbyterian in Iran, actually. They started in 1834 in Urumia. So they were almost like immigrants into Iran for a period of time up until 1980. So it's a very different reality from what you might think. Iran, to me, is the most fascinating, amazing, and beautiful place in the world. That's how I see it. And the people are amazing. And it's an incredibly diverse place with over 20 languages spoken. And the history, well, don't get me started on that because it goes back 6,400 years to the early establishments. Well, we used to go and visit the ziggurat in Chorazanville, which goes back to 3,200 years. And that was amazing, a step pyramid that you could go visit. And then there was Susa, an ancient capital of Iran, and you could see the digs there. And so Persepolis, amazing to go back and see this. So the culture, the history, I often tell Americans, think of Iran as if it were China. And it's very, very similar to China. I almost brought you a show and tell, you know, like a beautiful miniature from Iran, because the artistry of Iran is very close to the artistry of China. The carpets woven in Iran are the best in the world, I think, but very similar to a lot of the art done in Chinese carpets as well. And over thousands of years, those two great civilizations were actually in constant communication. So when I've gone to China, I feel like I'm in Iran in a sense. Kazakhstan, very, very close to Iran. I got to go there and it really felt like home to me. So I just wanted to convey how much I love Iran. I love the people of Iran. My heart goes out to everyone there. And the women of Iran are the most amazing women in the world, next to my wife and my daughters. Okay, I got some of them might be watching, so I have to say that. And my mother and my sisters. Anyway, I'll just stop there because, you know, I would love to tell you more. Hopefully we can get together and have real conversation over maybe a few hours, because that's what you need in Iran, is a few hours to have a serious conversation. So it's nice to meet you all, and I hope to see many of you again.
So I'm going to turn to PowerPoint, and while they get that up, I'm going to make a couple of comments. First, you wouldn't know from my bio because I don't put it in my CV, but I started my career working with refugees, starting in the United States with the Afghan refugees and Iranian refugees, and then in Pakistan and Turkey, which were the countries of first entry from the majority of Iranian refugees leaving in the 80s when I was working there. So if we have the clicker. So I was asked to talk about the constitutions, the revolution, and then sort of law in general. And I teach comparative law. And when I do this, I usually do these lectures over maybe 8 hours. So I'm going to do it in 8 minutes. I've pulled selectively some of my PowerPoint slides, and I'll have those up. I'm not going to read them. I'll make some comments just to give you context. Okay, so we're going to start with the revolution. One thing I want to note that there was a coup in 1953, the overthrow of the first democratically elected prime minister in Iran, which was a sort of fledgling democracy in the Middle East. There were very strong connections to the UK and the United States, but because of the oil industry, the UK, along with the United States, supported a coup of the democratically elected prime minister. Which you can imagine did not reflect well on the United States and our commitment to democracy. So we supported the Shah, who it was unclear at that time whether the Shah would have even continued and whether he might have become just a figurehead. But he became it was a strong monarchy after that time, supported actively by the United States and the UK. One of the strongest opposition voices throughout this period after the overthrow of Mossadegh was Ayatollah Khomeini, who became the leader of the revolution. He was a scholar. He was part of the religious establishment. So unlike Sunni Islam, in Shia Islam, Imami Shia Islam in Iran and Iraq, there is a formal clergy and there's a hierarchy. And Khomeini was at the top of that hierarchy, was very well respected, wrote many treatises, later recorded many sermons that were widely distributed around Iran. He was expelled from Iran in 1964, but became a very, very prominent critical voice outside when he was living in Iraq and then later in France. So the legal theory that he developed is called Vilayat-e Faqih. That is that there is a rule by the legal scholars, or at least the chief legal scholar, and he ultimately took that role of faqih, the chief legal scholar for the society. Now, this is a little more complicated. In Imami Shiism, the main separation in early Islam between Sunnis and Shias was a dispute about succession after the death of Muhammad. So the Sunnis had a sort of tribal electoral system where chief leaders would decide who was the next caliph. In Imami Shiism, there was a blood descent of leadership. And so there was a different descent. So Ali was the first imam. So Ali, who was related to Muhammad, became the first leader of the community according to Imami Shiism. There are then a total of 12 Imami Shi imams, and then the 12th imam disappeared. So he is in what's called theologically occultation. We're sort of awaiting his return as a sort of messiah. But the Faqih serves in that stead. The whole religious establishment of Shia Islam has that authority of the imams in some sense to lead the community. So they are, they serve as the legitimate successors to the authority of the imams and Muhammad before. Okay, so he develops this theory, which basically is a unitary state where it's the Islamic jurists who hold political power, hearkening back to the days of the Safavid Empire, one of the great empires of the sort of medieval Islamic period in the Middle East, expanded very far towards India and into Turkey, was always in dispute with the Ottoman Empire. So he was hearkening back to that as a model. So the revolution formally starts in 1979, but there were protests, large urban protests beginning in 1977, and then it accelerated at the beginning of 1979. The Shah fled because his security couldn't be guaranteed. Shortly thereafter, Khomeini returns. So in the papers in Tehran, there were headlines that Shah raft, the king has left. Imam Ahmad, the teacher, the leader has come back, which is very significant because using the term imam actually refers to the early imams in some sense. It's also a sort of general word for teacher, but it was used very symbolically to represent sort of the return of legitimate Shia authority. So you have this opposition to the monarchy, but it wasn't just in Islamic terms. It was a very broad coalition of liberal parties, socialist parties, communist parties, feminist organizations. There was very, very broad opposition to the government of Pahlavi. At the beginning, there was an attempt to sort of incorporate those different voices very early in 79. But gradually over the course of that year, the parties that were not affiliated with Khomeini were either shut down or marginalized. And then eventually by 1982, 83, at least 340 dissidents who had actively participated in the revolution were assassinated by the state, were executed by the state. So that's sort of the context of the early revolution. Now I want to get back to the Constitution. So one of the main projects of 1979 was to implement a constitution. So, and they were very sophisticated in drafting it. They incorporated pieces of Islamic jurisprudence, also pieces of sort of normal international law models of constitutions. And I'll talk a little bit about that very briefly. It had Islamist legalist elements drawn primarily from Khomeini, secular elements drawn from other constitutions, and some democratic institutions. But I think one of the problems that opposition movements like the current one face is that the structures that exist are so, it is so difficult to challenge them institutionally that I think that's one of the reasons why over the last 50 years, there hasn't been any sort of a really effective opposition movement. Let me jump down. Still got too far over time. So I'm happy to post these if people are interested later. But you know, there are sort of traditional things you would see in a constitution that are in the Constitution. There are democratic mechanisms. The president is democratically elected. The members of parliament are democratically elected. There are elections for local leaders. All of those people must be approved, however, by the Guardian Council, which is a council of senior religious leaders. So to even run, you have to be approved by this group that really has a lock on anything done by parliament. Okay, now the original model of Vilayat-e-Faqih sort of was idealistic. It thought that we don't have to have a system of taxation. People will just give their offerings and alms in the way that sort of was idealized in the early Muslim community, that there wouldn't be religious dissent, and that there wouldn't necessarily be problems of succession, although by 1989, Khomeini had to deal with that and amended the constitution. So the Constitution of 79 is amended in 89, primarily to provide for Khomeini to choose his successor, the current Ayatollah Khamenei. So one of the problems was Khomeini did not have the prestige of Khomeini in the religious establishment. So he didn't technically qualify to serve in that role. And so they amended the Constitution to lower the standards required for that position, and to formalize how it would be selected and to have new bodies sort of overseeing that, so that the direct choice of Khomeini would be chosen as a successor, but he's never had the authority and the prestige that was attributed to Khomeini as a religious leader, as a revolutionary leader, and as a thinker. And because they lowered those standards to some extent, there is a sense, I think, internally that the prestige of that role has never been the same, putting into question whether the system is actually going to survive another transition. Okay, now I want to talk about distribution of power, and I think this is a helpful picture. So everything really ties to the supreme leader, Khamenei. Now he's chosen by an assembly of experts, which is another group of religious thinkers, and they could theoretically remove him. So I think that's one of the only sort of institutional mechanisms that exists to sort of change if the current protests were to result in anything. The assembly of experts would be the party that would have to exercise it. I don't think that they have the political will to do that, but they could. And then the Guardian Council is sort of the interlocutor with Parliament. They get to determine who gets to run for all of these democratic positions. They also get to basically veto anything that is passed by Parliament. So if it's viewed as being inconsistent with Islamic jurisprudence, they veto it. It does not come into law. And then there's some, the Expediency Council sort of gets involved in disputes between the Guardian Council and Parliament. Now, final slide. One thing to think about, so I look at Islamic jurisprudence, and if you look at Islamic jurisprudence in Saudi Arabia, for example, it's much more informal and traditional. Law in Iran actually looks like law in France or the United States in many ways. There are legal codes. Now they're intended to incorporate traditional Islamic principles, but they have legal codes. They have formal legal process, the way we have civil procedure and criminal procedure in the United States. So those things really are institutionalized and quite sophisticated. And there have been movements. A colleague of mine at University of Washington looks at how women's movements used local family law in order to improve the situation of women using the mechanisms of law that exist. So there are examples where people have been able to execute a reform. However, for major structural changes like changing the government or the form of government or modifying the Constitution, those sorts of grassroots informal measures have not been successful so far. So I'll go ahead and stop there, but to give you sort of a general sense of the context in which the current protests have arisen.
No, it's my yeah. I don't know, who's next? Oh, okay.
I think I'm next, based on the fact that everybody's turning their necks and craning to look behind them. So thank you very, very much. I'm really grateful for the invitation. I'll try to keep my remarks as brief as possible. I know we have a pretty packed slate here today. I really appreciate being part of this conversation, and I really want to hear from your students as well with their thoughts. I was particularly excited to hear David Woodward's remarks about his personal family history as Presbyterians in Iran. That's obviously history I've written a great deal about in my book. And it's nice to meet a kind of living, breathing remnant of that history. So thank you for sharing some of that history. Indeed, the history that the United States has with Iran goes back much, much further than most people realize, even before the Presbyterians in a lot of ways. And, you know, I've written a lot about that in my book, but that's not what we're here to talk about today, obviously. I know that I've been asked to say a few things about the US-Iran relationship and how it feeds into some of the events that we've seen in recent days. And I think what I'm going to say might actually surprise you. For someone who is a historian of US-Iran relations, I actually really want to say that this is not about the United States, and this is not about US-Iran relations. What's happening today in Iran has everything to do with Iran and the feelings of the Iranian people and the frustrations that are being voiced. This is not a conversation that I think, the United States particularly belongs in. Having said that, of course, the United States remains the world's most powerful country, and of course has a long and very complex history with Iran. And of course, we are all sitting here in the United States, so it's natural that we might be wondering about kind of how our history with Iran interacts with all of this. I guess I would just want to say a little over 100 years ago, in 1919, there were pro-American riots on the streets of Iran. That is one of those little facts of history that has now long been forgotten. And the reason for that is that the Wilson administration had, sorry, excuse me, guys, could you, I'm sorry, I'm just doing this. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, I'm trying to do this with my, in the middle of my workday as well, so I apologize. In 1919, the Wilson administration had taken a very forceful stand for Iranian independence in the face of a very strong British sort of neo-colonial kind of attitude to Iran. The First World War ended. The Iranians had maintained their neutrality during the First World War and had that neutrality not respected. They'd been invaded by the armies of the Ottomans, of the Russians, the British, the French, and it was really only the United States that really stood up to some degree for Iranian independence after the end of the First World War. They wanted to be represented at the Paris Peace Conference. The British tried to keep them out of that conversation and say, no, we'll speak on behalf of Iran. And the United States lodged a very forceful protest about that and made sure that the Iranian public knew about it. The bazaars shut down. There were people rioting on the streets and cheering on the United States. We've obviously come a very, very long way since then. The United States has been, I would say, over the past century, either officially or unofficially, a sort of presence in a lot of Iranian protest movements, and there have been many Iranian protest movements since 1919. Most famously, of course, the very vivid pro-Mossadegh, pro-National Front protests of the early 1950s to nationalize the Iranian oil industry and get it out of the hands of the British. That, of course, was quashed by a lot of assistance from the United States by a CIA orchestrated coup. There were, of course, then the vivid protests that Khomeini whipped up into existence in 1963 and 1964, specifically complaining about the U.S. State as a Forces Agreement and the perception that American personnel were going to be given some kind of immunity in Iran, and that the country was being sold to the United States. And then, of course, most famously during the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the hostage crisis that followed, when Jimmy Carter's admission of the Shah to the United States provoked a really strong backlash in Iran when the Iranian revolutionaries and the students wanted to see the Shah returned to Iran to face trial. And that, of course, precipitated the takeover of the U.S. embassy that went on for over a year, and that resulted in the breaking off of diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran. I sweep through that history fairly quickly because what I really want to say is that's not where we are anymore. Protests that have taken in place more recently, in the last decade or two in Iran, have had nothing to do with the US. They've had to do with the frustrations of the Iranian people with their own government. And this is one of the perverse, I use this word very carefully, perverse or sort of ironic sort of achievements, if you will, of the Islamic Republic, is that it came to power demanding genuine independence, genuine foreign policy independence from the United States, and in many ways achieved that. But of course, one of the ironic one of the ironies of that achievement has been that people no longer blame the United States for their problems. they are able to see that their own government is responsible for their problems. And I'm always, as a student of history, as a student of politics, I think it's, you always see that the things, the very things that allow a state to kind of succeed and to come to power, or a particular system of government to succeed and to come to power, often later on become the seeds of its own downfall. And of its own weakness. And I think that's what we're seeing now, is that bizarrely one of the things that the Islamic Republic cared about so much in the early 1980s when it came to power, which was an ability to act, for Iran to act freely of foreign power interference, particularly of superpower interference, and especially of American interference. It put so much effort into achieving that, that 2 generations later, its own people no longer will blame or hold anyone to account except their own leaders. For their difficulties and for their suffering. So that's where we are now. I'm going to, I think, stop there and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation to link to mine. You might be wondering what Alejandra Gonza, an Argentinian, is doing here in this panel talking about Iran. And as Director of Global Rights Advocacy, I am an international human rights lawyer. So I do document, report, and represent victims of human rights violation. And that's how I got in touch with so many families affected by what we are talking about here, Iran human rights crisis. It's not a new crisis. It's a crisis that began a long time ago. It is really well documented and followed by the UN and other human rights institutions. And the work that I've done in the past is representing families that are a victim of what we call now a crisis within a crisis, which is the hostage crisis. It was recently mentioned that in the 70s, maybe you remember what happened with American diplomats and the embassy, and how Iran after that kept going on with the hostage diplomacy, as we call it now, using Americans, dual national foreigners, or any other person that has links with the United States or other countries that are considered the enemies of the Islamic Republic, families that are being trapped and arbitrarily detained internationally. That's how I started representing different families here. Oh, I don't know if this is now. So I started being involved with families that some of them live in Washington State, others don't, but they became kind of a horrible club that nobody wants to belong to, which is families that needs to deal with the United States, trying to even change law, policies, and practices to support Americans that are trapped abroad, and in this case, in Iran. These cases are not happening in a vacuum. The human rights crisis is really well documented, and it goes beyond discrimination against women. It goes beyond arbitrary detention only as one isolated issue. It's arbitrary detention as a crime against humanity, detaining so many people, so many human rights defenders, so many journalists, so many religious minorities, so many dual nationals, American Iranians, British Iranian, and other nationalities, European Iranians, that at the end it's been labeled as systematic human rights violations, right? And a crime against humanity. And of course, we can talk about other issues, right? But within my cases, they are falling in the context that all these panelists have described, that we are not dealing with a normal democracy. We are dealing with an authoritarian government, authoritarian regime that these cases are falling into what we call the lack of, judicial independence, right? The lack of due process. Any family falling on these crisis of getting someone out of an Iranian jail, they do not deal with the normal judicial system. The cases are built up of nothing. They don't have any evidence against the people that I do represent. The charges are espionage, corruption on earth, based on very vague laws. The most usual evidence is the confession under torture after solitary confinement and spending years in Evin prison. And the only purpose of doing that is from the very get-go, they are told, these people are told, I need to negotiate you with the United States. So that's what the concept of hostage is. Hostage taking is an international crime where Iran is just trying to use people as bargaining chips to get economic or even political benefits from other governments using these people and families to do that. And it is regulated. It is an international crime. And for a long time, the United States did not want to recognize them as hostages because they were not taken by private actors, and it's a state doing this. But more and more, this is something that it's already recognized and created some domestic structures to deal with it within the United States and other governments like the British government. And this is what we usually use to kind of give a little bit of understanding of the complexities of a hostage taking case, right? And it is not only the United States, it's so many different countries that need to get together to try to eradicate something that it's almost impossible to, because these people that fall under arbitrary detention, they are exchanged. Prisoner swap is one way of resolving these cases. Paying all debt for, tanks that they were sold and not given, like by the British government. That's another measure of getting people out of Iranian prison, right? And some countries have been very successful, and that's the United States, recently Britain and Australia. And you've seen that other countries are doing this, but in Iran, it's something that is continuing, and it's a worry. It's a worry that we all have, and that the idea of the protest right now is not that we are dealing with a new kind of thing. What is going on in Iran is not about a dress code. It's not about only one woman that died. She's a symbol of what happens in Iran. And it's also a wish to have a representative democracy, which is very difficult to get. And the two cases that I work in the past are one of the British Iranian family that recently was released from Evin prison. Have you heard about Evin prison? Evin prison is a horrible place. It's a place where these people have been tortured, put in solitary confinement. Recently, there has been a fire that put almost all the international hostages in danger. But it's also called a university, and a university by the hostages. And the reason is that the people Iran is detaining and putting together are incredible people, right? I represented an academic. He is a historian, and he's a Chinese American. No, he's American only, of Chinese origin. So his only nationality was being a US citizen. He is a UW alum. And he was just study history, right? And as soon as they got him with a US passport, they just wanted to negotiate him. He spent more than 3 years in Eben. He was filmed confessing he was a spy for the United States government, and then spent 3 years there until he was swapped in a humanitarian exchange of prisoners with Iran. And you may be wondering what you can do, right? Like right now, everybody wants to talk about Iran. Right now, it is important that institutions like universities discuss Iran in a more global context. It's not about the United States, but it's all about the United States too. Some of the families we are working with or we are in connection with that have still hostages in Iran are worried about what is going to happen, who is going to negotiate these people, right? So it's not one answer fits all the questions that we have, but it's important to support first the movement in Iran. People in Iran wanted the change. From the international human rights perspective, recently the Security Council held area formula discussion, which is extremely important for starting to push for the formation of a commission of inquiry in what is going on now in Iran. The protest and the repression is brutal. The total account of the death, it's like more than 250 people, and it's an undercount with 40 children already died, many more in prison now being prosecuted of all these big crimes, right? And even with death penalties on the horizon to be applied. So support every effort that you see there. I just put the Amnesty International petition to push for this commission and inquiry, and also to push for an urgent debate within the Human Rights Council on Iran and what is going on in Iran. That's one. And the other one is the Bringing Our Families Home, which is a campaign led by families that still have hostages in Iran. And of course, you haven't seen them much on the news right now because the hostage crisis, it's hidden under the more visible human rights crisis that the protests put on us on the media. So thank you very much, and I'm open to questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Azita Emami, and it's such a pleasure to be back here. I started my career in the United States here at Seattle University. I served as Dean of College of Nursing here between 2008 and 2013. So it was such a joy to be back here and see all of you. And I am not here as subject matter experts like my fellow panelists. I'm here as an Iranian woman in exile. I left Iran right after the Islamic Revolution, and since then, there's no day I am not thinking about how badly we failed the Iranian people, because I was one of those, teenagers at the forefront of the protests between 1977 and 1979, and when things went south, my family and we left Iran, and then we moved to Sweden, where I lived until 2008, when I moved to the United States for my position at Seattle U. And the Iranian revolution was so traumatizing for me, because it was really hijacked by, as my colleague Dr. Powell shared, it was really a combination of a lot of progressive liberal parties coming together and starting the revolution. It started from the University of Tabriz was the first universities rising, and we didn't know anything about any Ayatollah or any Islamic movement until the end of the revolution, where the revolution was literally hijacked, and that trauma made me that I really took distance from anything that would be, related to politics in Iran, because I just felt like a failure. This time, I'm very excited. And the reason why I'm excited, because this is a revolution that started by the Iranian women, brave Iranian, young Iranian women. And I really am, for the first time after 43 years, I'm very hopeful. The reason why I'm hopeful is that this is a grassroots, movement. As my colleagues also shared, it's not, controlled or led by any other foreign countries, and not even any, charismatic leader. This is the young people of the Iran who are just fed up, and they go on the street every day because they have decided that either I die or I make a change. And I'm so in awe and thankful for this amazing generation that hopefully are going to finish what we failed to finish in Iran, to really, stop the oppression and the inequity and injustice that were going on in Iran then during the Shah's regime, and then continued even worse during the Islamic Republic. So what I was asked what we could do to support the Iranian women. To be honest with you, I'm very, appalled and also disappointed that the global feminist, community, the global pro-justice community are not reacting, are not, supporting this amazing movement in an organized way. If you remember, the Me Too movement was very much, similar to what the Iranian women are doing today. That the women, rose across the globe, protesting for their choice, their rights, and everyone. It started in the United States, but the global community, we all, joined that movement. We marched across the globe to raise our voice for women's rights. And that is exactly what the Iranian women are doing now. There is no difference between what they want, the Iranian women, and what the feminists, the Iranian women across the world are claiming for their rights. They want to have the choice to wear what they want. They have to want the choice, making decisions about, their marriages, so, what is the difference between domestic violence, against women in the United States and what's going on in the homes of Iranian people where women don't have the right to say anything about their lives? And why is that the global, feminist communities, pro-justice communities are not, coming onto the street and joining the protests and then making those, massive marches that we saw during the Me Too movement? I really encourage all of you could be an agent for change, not only for the freedom of Iranian women and Iranian people, but also for the freedom of all the women across the globe. We are all fighting the same fight. We are fighting for our rights. We are fed up to be controlled and oppressed by men. We want that to happen for all of us. And I'm so afraid every day when I see that the global community is not reacting in an organized way, that if this movement will be cracked down, what does that mean for the entire, global female community in the world? It will be such a disappointment and such a regression to what we have already, done together. So I really hope that all of you join me and all of you use your voices through social media. Social media is a wonderful power these days, and that is what the Iranian people are using. This is the only one, although it's restricted, but it's used for the Iranian women to share their struggle, their fight every day. And I hope that we all used it, come on to the street, take onto the street and really raise your voices for the women's right, not only Iranian women's right, but all the global women's right. We are all fighting the same fight. Thank you very much. And I would like to ask you to if you have questions, comments, anything. I think that we still have some time.
So we just have a few minutes for questions. So if anyone has questions, we have a microphone that we can take to you. So you can ask your questions.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I have a question in respect specifically to the international community, because when I was studying human rights, one of the not just philosophical, but also practical implications and even a puzzle was the distinction between universalism versus cultural relativism. And at the time, there was a lot of discourse from many countries using the excuse that Western moral imperialism is coming to our countries and they're trying to impose their values. Not that I agree with that, but I think it is a problem in the sense that human rights and the sentiment definitely should come from within, because I think it increases the legitimacy of the notions of human rights. And in my discussions with some of my Iranian friends who actually live in Iran, the economic sanctions against Iran has made it very difficult for common people to leave Iran and study abroad. And for me, that's problematic because it limits the opportunity for human rights, the sentiment, the notion to come from within the Iranian people. So is the international community doing something in terms of the sanctions to, in a sense where it limits or it takes away some of the barriers that the Iranian people themselves are feeling because of the sanctions? I'm not sure if I made sense with my question. I know it was long.
Well, what I can say about that is, of course, sanctions that affect Iranian people, I will be very critical to that, but also there's an evolution in trying to get targeted sanctions that are not directed to the economic sanctions, but they are called the Magnitsky Act, which is trying to get accountability for human rights perpetrators and doing individually instead of the broader part of it. Of course, economic sanction is the most powerful way that countries like the United States can try to deal with Iran, right? But there have been different ways the international community reacted to that. There's a special procedure related to sanctions that is specifically drafting reports about how some economic sanctions can have that effect and should be lifted, right? And that's an international reaction to those specific sanctions, right? But more and more, and talking with the hostage situation, for example, Canada recently imposed a sanction to former foreign relations minister Zarif because of his involvement with hostages, right? He was a foreign minister going to the UN offering a prisoner swap in national television, Shiwan against someone, right? So he's a criminal. And so more targeted sanction is kind of the response of trying to get accountability. And the US also passed a Livingston Act, which is trying to do that, focusing more on the human rights perpetrator, but it's very difficult in terms of getting that accountability in the real life. And other families too, there was a movement from family members asking the US to deny visas to the daughters and sons and even the Iranian officials that are coming to the US to enjoy their lives and the universities and all that. And it was a demand from the families themselves, right? So it's always extremely difficult to kind of, balance all those things. But in terms of us as human rights advocates, we do advocate for accountability that will not impact people in Iran. That's from my, I don't know.
I just like to comment that in my decades in international education work worldwide, one of the biggest issues we have in the US is that we're pretty ethnocentric around all of these issues. It's very, very difficult if people live on a giant island and haven't been outside of the US to really understand what the entire global context is. And in dealing with Iran, we now have 40 years of basically internal propaganda as well. So there certainly are serious problems within Iran itself, but there are problems within the US too, right? And so we're part of that entire global humanity. And that's where we really have to sort of have an elevated understanding of how Iran fits within that entire human picture, rather than demonizing that one country as if it were the source of all the problems. And now we can see we're sort of in a renewed Cold War kind of an era with Russia, Iran, and China allying more closely. That changes all of these dynamics as well. So we really have to have a much more sophisticated understanding of all of these dynamics that are going on and how they impact people within Iran across the gamut. And it's a very complex country, over 80 million people with all kinds of backgrounds. And we can't just write off an entire part of the population because it's not our type of people. We have to take into account all of the people of the country as well and all of their needs. So I just think we need more humanity and more compassion in how we address these kinds of global issues, as well as understanding the legal aspects.
So I would like to also add that, any measures taken to stop enabling the Islamic Republic to survive would be welcomed. And I think that is different, as my colleagues just suggested, is very different from the previous, type of sanctions that would, impact the Iranian people and make life even more difficult for them. But there are other ways of sanctioning. And as you heard here, that's really right now, I think that those targeted sanctionings on the members of the Iranian government, and really stopping them to move their assets, not their assets, the Iranian people's assets that they have stolen, and allowing them to build, luxury lives abroad. These are the things that the global, other countries, global governments could do. And I really think that they could do much more than they are doing right now. I hope that again, putting pressures on them would, help that we see much more powerful reactions and measures that could stop enabling the Islamic Republic to continue surviving.
We are going to be mindful of the time of our speakers, and you guys, I know you have classes. So if you want, stick around and ask questions in person, but we're going to end the meeting so that anyone who wants to leave can leave. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if you have any follow-up questions, if the speakers would be willing to meet you outside of the classroom, we'd appreciate it. Thanks so much.
When they realize, really, really do, because of my whole mentality.